Last week we discussed what I refer to as the eclipse of sanctuary. We looked especially at that parliamentary statute of 1624, which formally removed both the concept of sanctuary, that is, a physical space where the law could not intervene, and also the concept of what was called the privilege of sanctuary. That also meant that the medieval idea of the seal of the confessional was no longer protected as a matter of statute. But I mentioned that I deliberately used the term eclipse to refer to sanctuary rather than another word that has been used, for example, by Carl Shoemaker in his book on medieval sanctuary. He refers to the destruction of sanctuary. I did not, because I think it was only an eclipse. Sanctuary was removed from statute law, and yet it has continued to have a life in other forms of custom, resistance, and argument. And we'll be considering some of those modes in which sanctuary has proven to reawaken in our time. Reawaken in our time not only in the sense that it has been very much in the news since the election of Donald Trump, but even before that, and not only in the United States. In fact, I've deliberately taken some of these examples of different models of new sanctuary from abroad, so that one can see the ways in which people in other cultures have struggled with many of the same issues. Once we've considered those models, then I would like to return to the early 17th century and discuss ways in which already, even as sanctuary was being removed as a matter of statute, it was moving into the center of the understanding of how it is that a civilized society ought to be organized. It's on the basis of that, I think, that sanctuary may be said to be awakening in our time, provided we ourselves are a part of that awakening. So I take the first model, the reassertion of classic right of churches, from just north of us in Canada, and refer to a work by Randy Lippert called Sanctuary, Sovereignty, Sacrifice, Canadian Sanctuary, Power, and Law. And as you see, I chose this example from before the recent election because already there were difficulties about immigration in Canada reaching back into the 1980s. I find this instructive because, relatively speaking, immigration law in Canada is more humane than it is in the United States. Nonetheless, there have been seizures and deportations that have been a matter of controversy, and as a result of that, certain Canadian churches, Lippert here describes which, and I'll turn to that in just a second, have formally offered sanctuary to people, although they have no statute right to do that. How is that possible? How can you simply say, we will give you sanctuary? That occurs because, although the right of sanctuary doesn't exist in Canadian law as a matter of statute, any more than it exists in British law, as a matter of custom, law enforcement prefers not to intervene in churches. And as a result of that, Lippert discusses the average length of time that sanctuary has been offered by Canadian churches in the 36 or so cases that he surveys. And what he discovers is, on average, it's about 5 months. 5 months of protection in some kind of residential accommodation, though there have been instances where that goes upwards of 1 year. And what that time has been used for is for the person seeking sanctuary to enter into discussion, usually not directly, but with an intermediary, with the authorities until the matter has been resolved. Now, that resolution might ultimately be deportation, because this is the customary assertion of a classic right. Churches are not in a position as a matter of force to deny entry to authorities, nor can they rewrite law. As a result, this kind of sanctuary is what I have called a porous shield. That is, yes, it's a shield. It will basically buy time, but one would be deluded to believe that it's going to prevent the assertion of law in any kind of absolute sense. And indeed, there may be circumstances in which reasserting classic rights of sanctuary that you don't have in statute law could be counterproductive. Just this past week, there have been raids by federal authorities in the United States that were targeted on cities that had declared themselves sanctuaries. They did that in order to make a point. Difficulty about asserting sanctuary in the case of a church is that it's a highly public declaration of where the people are that you are trying to protect, and you are asserting that protection on the basis of a statute that no longer exists. So it may have customary force, and if you lived in a civilized environment such as Canada prior to 2005, you might well find it highly effective. Whether it would be effective here would be a matter of experimentation. I have no doubt that many local authorities would be very reserved about going into a church where sanctuary had been claimed. As I've mentioned before, I've been in the position of having police interviewing me, not pressing me for information which they knew very well that I had. And they did so as a matter of their respect for a clerical function which has no standing in law. So there are circumstances where that can be effective, but one has to judge whether those circumstances in fact apply. Another model of sanctuary is no longer a shield, but really something of a sword. That is, an attempt to counteract statutes which are held to contravene the inherent human rights that are at stake. An example of this is an organization known as No More Deaths, which has developed a program of leaving water in the desert for the purpose of providing aid to people who need that water, many of whom are crossing without authorization into the United States. This is just one of many different kinds of activity that they have been involved with. And they have insisted as their principle that humanitarian aid is never a crime. That is, whatever a given law might say, if what you are doing is providing subsistence to someone, and especially if it's a matter of survival, then that rises to a higher standard than any force of law. This case actually adjudicates that principle, and the result is interesting, not completely encouraging, but also, in my view, shows a way forward. The case refers to one that occurred in September of 2010. This was the year of adjudication, And I take this example from the Syracuse Law Journal, where it's very nicely written up by Christina Campbell. In September 2010, the United States Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit reversed the criminal conviction for humanitarian Daniel Millis for placing water for migrants crossing the United States-Mexico border in the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge. Isn't this a wonderful irony? He put water in a refuge, but this is seen as being illegal. In 2008, Mr. Millis, an activist with the Sierra Club and the Tucson faith-based organization No More Deaths, Dos Más Muertes, has been found guilty of disposal of waste. The authorities couldn't think of any other charge to bring against him, so it's a bit like Alice's Restaurant. They decide that they're going to get him for littering. Okay, so the charge is the disposal of waste. No More Deaths, along with other faith-based organizations in southern Arizona, have adopted the slogan, "Humanitarian aid is never a crime," in support of their mission to leave water for migrants crossing the desert near the United States-Mexico border. Although the district court rejected Mr. Millis's defense that leaving full jugs of life-sustaining water for human consumption does not constitute littering, 2 judges on the 3-judge panel in the Ninth Circuit that heard Mr. Millis' case found that the term garbage in the regulation under which Mr. Millis was prosecuted is ambiguous and vacated his conviction on those grounds. So the adjudication could not bring itself to say it's ridiculous to charge someone helping someone else with littering. Instead, 2 of the 3 judges contend that we're not sure what it means to litter, and therefore this particular accused person will be released. Now, it seems quite clear that they would never have discovered this ambiguity in the term garbage unless the particular circumstances of this case were before them. They didn't wish to overturn the entire action of law enforcement, and to that extent, they did not endorse the principle that humanitarian aid is never a crime. On the other hand, it was because that principle was in play that they began to fiddle with their understanding of the statute. I'm not sure that this is a great moment in American jurisprudence. On the other hand, it does show the way in which the assertion of basic human rights can have an influence on the way in which statute law is applied. And in this case, it meant that one activity of the organization No More Deaths has been able to continue without the kind of quasi-legal harassment, which is what I would call it, that they have been subjected to in the past. Because of the way in which the enforcement of the law is selective, that's what the first model depends on. Enforcement of law is in fact selective. When you are pulled over for speeding, and the fact is you are speeding, and the policeman gives you a warning, that's an example of selective law enforcement and incredibly good luck. But the same applies to circumstances under this first model that we discussed, where the decision is made not to invade a place because sanctuary has been named as a principle. And it is also possible to shape law enforcement according to interpretation. That's the example we have in the second model, where the use of recourse to human rights can bring about a shift in the interpretive action of judges and others involved in adjudication. But that principle of articulating means of legal recourse also emerges under number 3 as a third model in which sanctuary can be developed. And this one I've taken from Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. His memo on sanctuary practices has been used by several communities in our area. Cities have done so, counties have done so, schools have indicated an active interest in their establishment as sanctuary jurisdictions. Now, when they're using that model, it really is different from number 1 and number 2. Different because when you say, for example, Kingston is a sanctuary city, you don't mean you're treating all of Kingston as if it were Canterbury during the Middle Ages. You're not saying anyone who goes to Kingston is not going to be prosecuted. You're also not asserting that over particular statutes that you object to. You are also not using the second model. You are not saying, here in the city of Kingston, we don't acknowledge laws that contravene human rights. Because both of those statements would be outside the competence of the city of Kingston or any city. Rather, the articulation of what it means to be a sanctuary city follows Schneiderman's advice. It is an excellent, well-crafted, and detailed document. And after he issued it, he followed up with an additional memo, from some of which I quote here under number 3. After closely reviewing the executive orders and the Department of Homeland Security memoranda, the New York Attorney General has concluded that none of the provisions contained therein alter or invalidate the analysis and model provisions set forth in the guidance. Localities still retain substantial discretion to limit their involvement in federal immigration law enforcement. That is the key to his position, not only here in this additional memo, but in the original guidance. I've given the address on the internet that permits you to go to that guidance in detail, but its principle is that federal immigration enforcement is a part of the administration of justice in the United States, but it is not a matter of the direct enforcement of law. That is, not to have papers by itself is not a crime. It is not the same as committing theft or fraud or engaging in violent behavior. Local law enforcement is there in order to deal with infractions of the law. And therefore, Schneiderman's advice is, because that is an imperative of local law enforcement, you should not permit yourself to be distracted with other concerns. So that should federal agents request you in law enforcement to hold on to a given suspect for suspicion of a possible violation of administrative law, which is not in fact a crime, you might well say, no, I'm not going to comply with that request. If there's not an actual warrant for the person, there is no imperative for you in local law enforcement to keep that person in custody. Much less is there for you to go after a person and put in custody someone with whom federal authorities would simply like to speak. It is very similar to the situation of individuals involved with the concern for sanctuary. If a federal agent wishes to knock on my door, that is the right of the federal agent. If the federal agent asks to come in, that is his right under rules of courtesy. But I am not obliged to let him in, nor am I obliged to say who happens to be living on my property. That is, within this understanding of articulating means of legal recourse to local or national abuse, it might well be that the citizen's right of privacy is a stronger sanctuary shield than claiming sanctuary in a church. We may be in a situation in certain circumstances where the willingness of people who are concerned with those seeking sanctuary to bring them into their homes, and if necessary to move them from one home to another in the manner of the old Underground Railroad during the time of slavery, might be more effective than basically announcing to the world where exactly they could find immigrants by saying, oh, they're in this public place, which we're also naming as a sanctuary. So that third model that Eric Schneiderman has pioneered, and which other attorneys general have picked up in other states. California, I understand, has now proceeded to the state where the entire government has declared that it is a sanctuary locality. That's in the same model as number 3. It's a very interesting development, requires a great deal of discernment and resourcefulness to apply. And as in the other cases, and the one I'm about to refer to now, one should never be surprised if there is pushback and if there is a certain penalty to pay for resisting federal authorities. That may well come. But then we come to the most radical of the models, and it has been pioneered in France, as you might suspect. But I especially wanted to include this model because very often those of us who have contact with France tend to have contact with France during the summer. And therefore, we may have been aware of the extent to which social life is from time to time there disrupted by strikes. Typically, if you read the local press, strikes are seen as annoyances for reasons which are understandable, but here's an example where strikes can also be highly effective and where communal radical action to insist that a certain policy is not acceptable can have a positive result. In this particular case, I think we can see that, but we also quickly become aware that once you establish direct protest as a method, it is also very difficult to control. So in the particular case, which comes from a book by Linda Rabin called Give Refuge to the Stranger, in April 2008, with the help of the General Confederation of Labor, that's one of the major unions in France, 1,000 sans-papiers launched strikes and occupations. Who are the sans-papiers? That literally just means without papers. They just happen to be undocumented, living in France, but working. And yet they found themselves subject to search and legal harassment and the threat of expulsion to the extent that they found unacceptable, and so they went on strike. In the cleaning, construction, retail, security, and catering industries where they worked. The government responded by offering to legalize 1,000 undocumented workers, exactly the number of sans-papiers who had originally protested. But the question was immediate, did this go far enough? Because that was 1,000 of the sans-papiers, but there are probably at that time 400,000 in France. And there would today be more than that. Of course, that's very small still compared to what we're dealing with in the United States. In May, and this is the wrinkle which I found very interesting and instructive, in May, the sans-papiers occupied CGT headquarters in Paris after the CGT would not allow them to submit their own applications for legal residency to the local government. That is, the union wished to say, well, we joined with you in your protest, therefore you don't go to the local authorities for your papers, we'll represent you. And the sans-papiers saw this as abrogating their own agency to take responsibility for themselves, so they occupied the labor union headquarters. One member of the groups declared, the CGT has taken the sans-papiers movement hostage, we are taking the union hall hostage. So as I mentioned, the difficulty is that once you start down this road of civil protest, directing the flow of events can become very difficult. Nonetheless, there has been consistent reform of French government policies in regard to the sans-papiers, even in the face of what seemed to be a credible electoral threat from the National Front in France. This is not a story by any means which is over. Immigration remains an issue in Europe, every bit as delicate as it is in the United States. But here's a case where one can see that civil disobedience can have its effect. The heartening part of this example is the way in which French government policy was changed. The disheartening part of it is the way in which the organization of the protest wound up turning against itself, as does frequently happen where civil disobedience is concerned. So we have a model of the customary assertion of classic sanctuary, no longer statute law, but something that one can appeal to, especially at a local level. We have the assertion of certain human rights that transcend law, the second model. We have the use of legal resources to find protections in the slippage between federal and local law, number 3. And 4, finally, we have civil disobedience, all as vibrant models of sanctuary which currently have been proven to work, not only in the United States, but also elsewhere. And that leads me to the question of how it is in our post-Enlightenment culture, which had seen the apparently categorical removal of sanctuary in 1624, we still see its awakening at the moment. And so here I return to the early 17th century and point out that even in 1624, there was another form of sanctuary emerging from a surprising quarter and articulated by an even more surprising person. The one who articulates this principle, which I believe underlines all of these forms of sanctuary I've referred to, is John Milton, the poet. Now, Milton, long before he wrote Paradise Lost and became very famous as a poet, was a propagandist. John Milton worked for the government of Oliver Cromwell, for the simple reason that Milton, like Cromwell, was a dedicated Puritan. And he believed that Puritans like himself had every right to believe what he believed, even if the law of the land of England required you to belong to the Church of England. In fact, you could resist that. And Milton, together with Cromwell, sought so vigorously to insist upon this principle that it seemed a very good idea to behead Charles I, the King of England, in 1649. The English Civil War was every bit as disruptive as the French Revolution much later, and as violent. And after that beheading, John Milton, because he was the propagandist for the government, wrote a book explaining why beheading Charles I was a wonderful idea. The name of the book is On the Tenure of Magistrates and Kings. It was released very shortly after this remarkable act of regicide. And in this composition, Milton shows just how vigorous his prose was and gives an indication of why he ultimately would become a fine poet. In his book, he writes, "No man who knows aught can be so stupid to deny that all men were naturally born free." It seems to Milton that that is why, if any king becomes abusive and counteracts the natural freedom of human beings, it is appropriate to depose and kill that king. And how does he know that's the case? That all men were naturally born free. He goes on to say, being the image and resemblance of God himself. In other words, the picture that Milton develops, and he goes in to cite the book of Genesis to explain what he means, is that it is within the decision-making powers of human beings that they show their resemblance to God himself. And that therefore this capacity is not something which is granted to anyone except insofar as it's granted by God. This is the basis on which John Locke would later assert the existence of natural rights, and why the Declaration of Independence would refer to people as being endowed by their creator. I'm sorry, Thomas Jefferson was not original. He's actually showing the influence of John Milton and John Locke, which in turn is passed on to the Declaration of Rights in France, and finally to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The point of all these rights is when you enumerate them, that does not imply that that's all the rights they are. Because once you start from one simple position, it is quite clear that every human being is a kind of sanctuary. Every human being is the nearest representation you and I will ever find on earth to God. And that is not merely a Puritan principle. It's not only a principle shared by those who read the book of Genesis, which is really quite a large number of people. It's actually also represented more widely than that, and in fact could be asserted by an atheist. An atheist could easily say that human beings are the nearest thing we will ever find to the divine. And in fact, if atheists have any sense, that's exactly what they say. Once the understanding emerges that there is a sanctuary that each person represents, then it's clear that whatever rights that person has are not granted to the person by a government or by a society, not even by a person's parents. I never told my sons this, but the fact is that their rights are inherent or inalienable because it is a part of their very organic character. Once that becomes the case, and one realizes that, then sanctuary emerges as an imperative that has to be deployed along a variety of areas. That it's not merely a question of immigration, but yes, of course, it is that. In a sense, we should be grateful for the immigration crisis for showing us what the principles are that should cause us to recognize sanctuary in each person. But beyond questions of immigration, sanctuary is also a principle that can be realized in the field of work, which should be dignified and properly remunerated for every person. Interesting, isn't it, how when you decline sanctuary in one area, for example, immigration, you tend to decline it in another area, work. Oh, he's an illegal immigrant, therefore I can pay him below the minimum wage. And how once denied there, we might also deny a person sanctuary in the field of health or in the field of education. A couple of years ago, as part of the collaborative process of courses between West Point and Bard College, there was a very interesting paper given by a lawyer from West Point on how environmental rights should be recognized as human rights on the grounds that those who suffer from environmental pollution are disproportionately disprivileged in other areas. They tend to be poor. They tend to belong to racial minorities. And so Robert Goldstein developed the idea that we should see environmental safety as part of the civil rights movement, so that people are not subjected to the pollution that they currently are. Well, that would mean that on the basis of what amounts to the recognition of a simple principle, one nonetheless would be engaged across a broad range of practices and activities, all aimed to realize one simple goal, that is, the sanctuary that is in each person, but is all too often denied as a matter of convenience or political expediency. I would say we just happen to be living in an era when political expediency makes it very easy indeed to deny sanctuary to large parts of our population. So it's a moment to become better at articulating sanctuary and also putting it into practice. Thanks very much indeed for coming. Yes, please, Al.
The Cappadocians, I think it was Gregory Nyssa, wrote a wonderful essay about the impossibility of slavery because no person can own another person, both of whom are in the image of God. How much more can we say about it?
Excellent. No, I think that is a very useful reminder of the way in which the analysis of each person as being in the image of God led theologians and eventually people in churches, after a very long time, to oppose the very institution of slavery. Now, at first, and this happened soon after the conversion of Constantine, at first, Constantine encouraged what was then called manumission, that is, releasing slaves, making them free. Something to bear in mind that when you released a slave in antiquity, you still had responsibility for that person. You were still that person's patron, which means that it was not simply a matter of saying, oh, it's fine, you're no longer my slave, bye. You would still be involved with the household. There would still be a degree of responsibility. So manumission in antiquity, because of the structure of Roman society, was actually asking you to do more than simply free a slave. And for that reason, Constantine, as part of his general reform, stipulated that on the whole, courts should not convene on Sundays. We should have Sundays off so that people could worship, because after all, now Christianity was a legal religion. But he made an exception. He said, if anyone wants to manumit a slave, then the court can meet on the Sunday. And so at a later period, the Cappadocian fathers then go on to pick up the drift of what Constantine was saying in statute law in that case, and to argue that, in fact, there is an inherent contradiction in recognizing a person as being in the divine image and holding that person as a slave. I think that's exactly the case. But then we might also apply that to holding that a person is made in the divine image and providing that person with a wage that you know to be less than is required for the survival of that person and the family involved. Or to live in a society which refuses to deal with the issue of what sort of medical care that person would receive. Those are also contradictory. And that's why I do think, as part of sanctuary awakening, is exactly the time now to take seriously what it means to assert that there's an affinity between people and the divine. Thank you for that example. It's a very good one. Yes, please. Where in that formula would sacrifice? I think sacrifice takes its part because, as I was saying earlier on in the series, if we look to the emergence of sacrifice, initially speaking, we see that it came about because of the understanding that that is the place where there is communication between the human and the divine, which is why sanctuary in the ancient world developed as a part of that sacrificial activity. The sacrifice was seen as being primordial, and because primordial, the place where it occurred, the sanctuary, was not subject to humanly made institutions. Now I think we're in a similar situation, only the sanctuary involved is no longer a geographical location. It is rather the person in herself or herself, which is also the place where today sacrifice takes place. That is, when we act not according to self-interest, when what we do is not determined simply by convention or by our desire for gratification or by our sense of profit, but we act freely and openly in a sacrificial manner, in an act of self-giving. That, I would say, represents the way in which sacrifice also has been metabolized inside human identity, just as sanctuary has. And that's occurred as a very widespread principle which most people can understand and actually assent to. Most people, I dare say, even most people among the 1%, would agree that not all human activity should be self-interested. That there is something intrinsically worthwhile about the human capacity to link to a principle and an action on the basis of its transcendent appeal. Not because it's good for me or good for my family, but simply because it is good. It not only attracts me, but it causes me to cooperate with it and even to extend it if I can. Clearly, that is a basic part of the operation of every religion that I have ever encountered, and not only a matter of religion. I would argue that it is very much a part of the human character itself to be engaged in that question and in the action for the transcendent good. The good, the transcendent, is not only a matter of what looks nice, but also a matter of what one does, of how one participates in that which is good. If that is not included in one's understanding of what makes for humanity, the results are very limited indeed. And I think, therefore, that it is a principle that can be commended as a matter of a serious analysis of the way people function, not only in religious environments, but in social environments, generally speaking. Sure. Yes, please, Fred.
If one was to participate in sanctuary, how would they go about beginning?
Excellent question. Because of this issue of how does one participate in sanctuary, alongside these discussions that we've been having, I've also convened a course at Bard, which is dealing with sanctuary as not only a theology, but also a social action in our community. As a result, the students in the course have taken their time at the beginning of the semester not only to do the reading for the course, which I did not impose on you, I assure you, it was quite dense. So they have done the reading for the course so that they can see what sanctuary has been in the past, how it has worked. And in addition to that, they have identified groups in the community with a view towards themselves engaging with those groups, joining with them, observing, participating. On the basis of that preliminary work, they have made their choices. I think most everyone in the course has decided on the group affiliation. They are distinct groups across a range of activity. Some are specifically for questions of immigration. How do you help people who get themselves in trouble as a result of immigration and customs enforcement? How can they be aided? Some deal with questions of English language instruction to people who are living in this country, working, many of whom are not documented, and therefore in the process of English language instruction, other kinds of instructive opportunities also emerge, which can protect them in their environments. There is another group that basically takes the opposite turn. Instead of English language instruction, one of the students concerned will be teaching in Spanish. And the concept is to teach in Spanish to students and their parents who have difficulty appreciating principles of science. And so what he is investigating is whether that kind of activity also opens up ways in which you can offer protection to those involved. And then finally, there is also a group in Hudson which is attempting to be an off-grid community. That is, to live on land that is not private and not public, but which is also therefore not taxable, and which can offer accommodation to people who may be seen as irregular in their residency in the United States. So each of the students involved will then report back on this group. We're also asking leaders of these groups to come and to speak to us. When I say to us, in the future, as Fred mentioned earlier on, we'll take a few other Fridays, but not immediately. We have to arrange the dates. A few other Fridays when community leaders will come right here, same time, same place, but I don't yet know the dates, and tell us what they're doing, how they have attempted to extend the principle of sanctuary. And also, of course, one of the reasons they'll be coming is they'll be looking for people who might like to cooperate with them. On those occasions, I'll also be having my students design interview questions in advance, so that my students will be taking a direct part once the initial presentation has been made. My students will cross-examine the particular presenter. They get graded on this activity, so they're going to be tough. And then on the basis of that, we can open it up to a more general discussion. My hope is by the time we're done doing that, we'll have a specific answer to Fred's question, that we shall be able to see local groups in which a person could become involved. At the very least, we will better understand how these groups extend the concept of sanctuary, whether sanctuary is part of their stated purpose, or it is simply a principle that turns out is being developed because of their work. So I'm quite excited to see the results of that kind of interaction, which should happen over the next couple of weeks. Semester ends already early on in December, so I would like to have these groups in and the discussion completed before the end of November. But I'm always optimistic about time, so I might be wrong about that. And the Cardinal of Red Hook has just given me his sign, so thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you when those presenters come along. Thank you.